and host of the podcast On Brand with Donny Deutsch. Donny Deutsch. Also with us, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist and associate editor of the Washington Post, Eugene Robinson, is with us this morning. Good to have you all. So, Hillary Clinton giving a bit of a dynamic shift for this time around, at least so far. Gene, your latest piece for the Washington Post is entitled "The Double Standard for Harris and Trump Has Reached a Breaking Point." And in it, you write in part, quote, "Somehow it is apparently baked into this campaign that Trump is allowed to talk and act like a complete lunatic, while Harris has to be perfect in every way. I don't know the answer to the chicken or egg question, whether media coverage is leading public perception or vice versa. But the disparate treatment is glaring. Let's review. First, Harris was criticized for not doing enough interviews. So she did multiple interviews where she was asked questions that held her accountable. I'm adding that, including with non-traditional media. She was criticized for not doing hostile interviews, so she went toe-to-toe with Bret Baier on Fox News. She was criticized as being comfortable only at scripted rallies, so she did unscripted events, such as the town hall on Wednesday. Along the way, she wiped the floor with Trump during their televised debate, the only one they had, because he won't debate again. Trump, meanwhile, stands before his MAGA crowds and spews nonstop lies, ominous threats, impossible promises, and utter gibberish. His rhetoric is dismissed or looked past without first being interrogated.
So Gene, chicken or the egg? I mean, who's to blame here?
This is so right.
You asked the question, but I will say the media 9 years in still don't know how to cover this guy because he says outrageous things every night. The papers just pass by him. I mean, you look the papers, even after he said, "I'm going to put the National Guard and the military after my Democratic opponents, enemies of the state." In any other time, any other presidential election, that would have been banner headlines in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. None of them had it on the front page.
Yeah, no, and that's kind of shocking. Look, you're absolutely right that we have not collectively learned how to cover Donald Trump over the last 10 years. Some of us have, but a lot of us haven't, and so that's definitely a factor. But it's also true that when the media do cover some just inescapable excess of Trump's, and I talk to people or hear from people on the Republican side who've read it, who've heard it, who know all about it, and they just shrug. And so it's not that nothing is sinking in. It's not that nothing is going out there about Trump. So that's why I'm not fully ready to say it's all the media's fault. I don't think you can say it's going to be the fault of the New York Times if Donald Trump wins. I think there's a lot of guilt to go around. But I wrote that column just because I wrote it on Wednesday, and I wrote it because in the morning I was listening to the audio of Michael Schmidt's interview with General Kelly, Donald Trump's longest-serving chief of staff, his closest aide in the White House, telling us how Trump was a literal fascist. Textbook definition of fascist, how he admired Hitler, how he wanted to be a dictator. This is the guy who worked for him for a year and a half and is telling us, without being partisan about it, it's just like flashing red lights and blazing sirens about voting for Donald Trump again and giving him that power again. And then that night, Vice President Harris does a town hall on CNN and for good reason, in my opinion. She answers a lot of questions with that kind of criticism of Donald Trump. He is a fascist. You can't vote for this guy. We have a choice here, and we need to make the right choice. And then afterwards, and the next day, I hear and I read all this about, well, did she close the deal? Was she specific enough here or there? This is an existential question, people, and it's just not the same thing. They're not being covered in the same way remotely, and I think not being covered in a fair way.
And last night, Donald Trump calling the United States of America, quote, a garbage can, just to add to the rhetoric there. So, Jon Meacham, we have reached a strange, extraordinary, perhaps dark place when we can get this big piece from The Atlantic and Jeffrey Goldberg, and we can hear directly from General Kelly talking to Michael Schmidt of the New York Times about his admiration for generals of the Nazi army. Why can't my generals be more like Hitler's generals? Denigrating veterans, denigrating service members who've died, things like that. And people we talk to a lot of the similar people who like Donald Trump, and they say, he didn't mean that. That's just Trump being Trump. He's blowing off steam. There's always some excuse, some landing place they give him, and perhaps themselves, to be able to put their heads down and march through it.
That's exactly it. You know, Vice President Harris isn't on trial here in the same way President Biden wasn't on trial when he was running. We are. The American people are on trial. And if we choose, if a sufficient number of us in a sufficient number of states choose to ignore the evidence that, as the Bible says, those with eyes to see and ears to hear can detect, then there's we have no excuse. We might have an explanation, which is that for a series of reasons, people are not holding the Republican Party and the nominee of that party to rational account. And I think that this is a test of citizenship in a way that certainly you'd have to go back, I think, to both the 19th century and the civil rights era to find anything equivalent. I think Gene's exactly right in that the conventional media conversation just isn't commensurate to, and hasn't been for a long time, to this election. This is not Bob Dole and George Mitchell duking it out with Bob Novak. You know, it's just, that's like talking about the Peloponnesian War, right? This just isn't that. And, you know, we can lament it, and we should, but what we really have to do, I think, is insist that if you believe in what you say you believe, and everybody we know, Willie, everybody we know believes that they're constitutionalists, they're Americans, they believe in the country. Well, if you believe that, if that's what you say you believe, patriotism is not nationalism, and Trump is a nationalist. It's nationalism is loyalty to your own kind, right? To people who look like you, who are exactly like you. Patriotism is allegiance to an idea. The idea that, as Thomas Jefferson articulated it, and the Constitution has tried to actuate it, and however imperfectly, we've managed to realize just a little bit more through the years. And that's been the conversation in America. And the conversation could take a radical, risky, and possibly irreversible turn if we don't pay attention.
Yeah.
So thank you, Jon, as always. So eloquent, and it's such an important message. By the way, if you had Peloponnesian War on your bingo ticket this morning for Jon Meacham, you can check that off. Harper's Ferry will be the final for many ticket holders, and you can, of course, shout bingo, and we will send you a $1 million check from Elon Musk. John Meacham, as always.
Thank you, Meacham.
Thank you so much. Very, very important words.
All right.
Very
Vice President Kamala Harris held a rally last night in Georgia where she appeared side by side for the first time with former President Barack Obama. The crowd of 23,000 people, the largest of her campaign, also heard from Tyler Perry and Bruce Springsteen.
In my dad's garage, driving all night, chasing some mirage. Well, pretty soon, darling, I'm gonna take charge. Well, the dogs on Main Street howl, 'cause they understand. If I could take one moment into my hands, mister, I ain't a boy, no, I'm a man. And I believe in the promised land.
Here's something about an American dream. Fort McPherson was once a Confederate Army base where there were Confederate soldiers trying to plot and plan on how to keep 3.9 million Negroes enslaved. Now that land is owned by me.
You ask Donald Trump what he's going to do to make health care more affordable. His only answer is end Obamacare, end the Affordable Care Act. He doesn't really know why he wants to end it, except for the fact that I passed it. The problem he's got now is that it's popular, because 50 million people have gotten health care because of it. So, a couple weeks ago, you remember during the vice presidential debate, his running mate had the nerve, had the chutzpah to say that Donald Trump, quote, salvaged the Affordable Care Act. Donald Trump spent his entire presidency trying to tear that thing down, and he couldn't even do that right. And now, 8 years after he was elected, when he was asked, well, what are you going to do? He says, well, I've got concepts of a plan.
Before I was Vice President of the United States, before I was a United States Senator, and before that, a two-term Attorney General for the state of California, and before that, a district attorney and a courtroom prosecutor. And in those roles, I took on perpetrators of all kinds: predators, fraudsters, and repeat offenders. I took them on, and I won. Well, Georgia, in 12 days, it's Donald Trump's turn. Women have died because of these bans, including a young mother of a 6-year-old son right here in Georgia. Her family is here with us tonight, and we speak her name, Amber Nicole Thurman. And you all have heard me say, look, I do believe Donald Trump to be an unserious man, and the consequences of him ever being president again are brutally serious. These are just some of the consequences of the Trump abortion bans and what he does and what he's likely to do.
So, Donnie, it was a star-studded appearance last night for the vice president outside of Atlanta, must-win a battleground state there. We should note that she'll be joined by Beyonce this evening in Texas. Her message talking about how she's got a to-do list for the American people, while Trump is just for himself, and also dwelling there quite a bit on abortion rights and reproductive health care. Contrast, if you will, Donnie, with what we're hearing from Donald Trump in these last days, where his closing argument is about calling America a